This is Survey of Economics PowerPoint Lecture 2.3 on the basics of fiscal policy. We have here the objectives is to learn the motives and mechanisms of fiscal policy, the idea of aggregate supply and demand, why, when, where, how the government uses economic stimulation of the economy using fiscal policy, and then finally to look at the consumption multiplier to see the effect of these policies. Fiscal policy, roughly put, there's three basic tools. First is government spending, which, as we saw in economic growth and business cycles in the discussion of the GDP, is part of the gross domestic product. Taxation and regulation, and these will affect us as well. And I should probably point out at this point that it is not our intention here, and it is well beyond our scope, to offer any kind of, I guess, what I would call political punditry. We are going to offer both an analysis and, in some cases, a critical analysis of the fiscal policies and what has gone right and gone wrong in them over a number of different administrations, and see the different approaches that various presidential and congressional administrations have done in fiscal policy. The first question we'll ask ourselves is, why is it that the government intervenes in the economy? And this is not a given, okay? Time was. The United States was founded on the principles of laissez-faire economics, and in the early days, there was no government intervention at all. This is something that takes students a little bit by surprise now, because government intervention in the marketplace is now an accepted practice. No one questions it. Neither Republicans or Democrats question government intervention in the economy. They don't question whether or not the government should intervene. They just question how, why, when, where, how much. The first government intervention in the marketplace in the United States was actually back in the 1840s with government regulation. It was the Steamboat Boiler Inspection Act of, I think, 1847, which regulated the quality and control of steamboat boilers, because they had a nasty tendency to blow up on the rivers. Now, the first reason that the government typically intervenes is to create economic stimulation. And this is that during a recessionary period, the government will intervene by either attempting to adjust the aggregate supply curve or the aggregate demand curve to stimulate the economy back into growth, either by increasing spending, cutting taxes, or both. And the first time that this was really done, and we'll deal with it a little bit anyways, it's really the subject of U.S. history too, which covers the Great Depression era. The real first attempt at this was by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the application of Keynesian economics to try to pull the country out of the Great Depression. And it should probably be noted, and I'll note it elsewhere too, that under classical economic theory, and up until the 1930s, the economy will correct itself on its own. It's just a matter of time. The problem is that during that time period, what are the societal costs that are being borne? You have people out of work, you have people starving, you have et cetera, et cetera. And so in the 30s, the government began, and from that point forward, it's been just a constant episode or series of episodes of government intervention in the marketplace. The second main reason is market correction. Okay, to correct for what we refer to in economics as market failure. If markets fail to clear, in other words, they don't achieve an equilibrium, the government will intervene in an attempt to restore that equilibrium. Another reason is regulation, okay, to referee economic competition, to make sure the game is fair. This is largely the purview of the Security and Exchange Commission, though Congress gets involved in it. And the idea also, the regulation will minimize the cost of competition in the business cycle to society, which I just kind of mentioned during the Great Depression. And then finally, the provision of public goods. This is something that we'll just touch on because it really does get into a separate subfield of economics all on its own. The provision of public goods. Public goods are goods, and we'll deal with them. We'll deal with them. Public goods typically are beyond the budget of any individual to provide. Okay, and yet most individuals deem them as being necessary. A relatively common example of a public good is either national defense, or a police force. In many cases, people think of public education as a public good. It's really beyond the capacity of any individual to purchase it themselves, yet they benefit from it, they want it, and so the government will do it. We now get into aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and at this level, we're just touching it. Right now, actually, I'm preparing lectures for intermediate macroeconomics, which is one level above macroeconomics, which is one level above what we're doing here. And so at that level, it gets really quite complicated. We really go into a full exposition of it. Here, we just want to get the basics. Aggregate supply, and this is one of the things I attempt to emphasize as best as I can with students. Aggregate supply is not the sum total of individual supply. It bears some similarity. We dealt with microeconomics, and we dealt with the microeconomics, and we dealt with individual supplies there. Okay, it bears some resemblance to that. It is shaped the same way. It is a positive correlation. But what causes aggregate supply and what causes aggregate supply to shift is entirely different. Okay? Aggregate supply, simply put, is the total supply of goods and services in the economy at various price levels in a given time period. Okay? It is identical with the gross domestic product. Now, we want to rest on this point here for a minute. When we talk of total production, the gross domestic product, which we just talked about during the business cycle and economic growth, we indicate that with Y, and I will do that throughout this PowerPoint and hereafter. One thing that is important to remember, okay, and I will emphasize it again. When the economy is in equilibrium, money out equals money in. When we dealt with the gross domestic product a couple of lectures back, okay, we used, and the one that's most commonly used because it's easier to use, is what we refer to as the output formula. Okay, you measure the amount that is produced, not the amount of income that is made. The two things get you to the same number, and that is because output equals income. Okay, and output equals income because the money that I go and spend when I buy products becomes income to someone else, which they then go and spend on products, which becomes income to someone else. Okay? Aggregate demand, again, is not the sum total of individual demand. It is not the same as individual demand. Of the two, aggregate demand is more different than microeconomic demand than aggregate supply is of microeconomic supply. Okay? Aggregate demand we'll get to. Okay? Largely aggregate demand centers on the demand for money, and we'll get there when we get there. This is the total demand for goods and services at various price levels during a given time period. Now, as with microeconomic supply, the aggregate supply curve is not a static entity. It's not static. In other words, it moves. It's dynamic. Okay, the question, of course, is what causes it to move? And you see here, the primary reason is going to be cost of production. Okay, now at upper levels of this course, of this discussion, really all of this has to do with the equilibrium level of output. Okay, we won't get into that kind of complexity. I'll just hint at it here. The basic idea is that you have a balance. You have equilibrium between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, if aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, you'll have increases in aggregate supply and vice versa. We're not going to deal with that as much here. We're going to kind of hint at it. Okay, that's ultimately where this is going. Instead, we look at costs of production. Now, this is similar in some respects. Okay, but again, remember, it's not entirely identical to individual supply curve changes. What we have here that we didn't have at all in microeconomics, in our discussion of microeconomics, is the idea of foreign demand. Okay, and you can say it's fairly intuitive. If the United States is selling products overseas, that means foreign demand, okay? And the aggregate supply curve will go up because domestic producers have to produce for export markets, okay? Foreign supply. Foreign supply is very similar to the idea of foreign demand, okay? Note that an increase in foreign supply does not necessarily increase domestic production and therefore does not necessarily lead to growth. What that means is U.S. assets producing overseas. That doesn't necessarily increase domestic production, okay? It does, however, increase overall aggregate supply. And then finally, what we haven't brought in before, and what we don't have in microeconomics at all, is the idea of interest rates. And we'll deal with this a little bit more when we get to monetary policy and the monetary system. But right now, I'll introduce the idea that when we think of an interest rate, okay, and we all kind of intuitively know what is meant by an interest rate. An interest rate is a percentage that lenders charge borrowers for the use of the money, okay? So in many respects, we think of interest rates as the cost of borrowing money. As interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing the money is greater. As interest rates drop, the cost of borrowing money is less. Okay? And so if interest rates drop, if the cost of borrowing money goes down, then more people will borrow it. We know this from the law of demand. Okay? Well, as more people borrow money, usually for various investments, aggregate supply will go up. Now I have a note here, a shift in the aggregate demand will create movement along the aggregate supply curve, but not a shift of aggregate supply. Now in the long run, those movements along the aggregate supply curve will create shifts in the aggregate supply, but in the short run, this will not happen, okay? We see here the graphic illustration of aggregate supply curves, and this should be at least passingly familiar to you from our discussion in microeconomics. It moves very similarly, okay? We have increases in supply, okay? Movement from AS1 to AS2, that's characterized by A here. You see what happens. You have, over the long run, a decrease in prices, an increase in output, very similar to what we had in microeconomics, with all the factors that we just covered causing the increase in supply. And then over here, from movement from AS1 to AS3, you have a decrease in aggregate supply. This is noted by the area B. You have an increase in price, a decrease in the equilibrium output, okay? This brings us to aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is largely the demand for money. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to bring us to this conclusion, okay? Aggregate demand is buying, okay? That's the total amount of stuff that's bought in the economy. That's aggregate demand. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if people are buying more, they need more money to buy it with, or with which to buy it. I shouldn't dangle the preposition, I guess. With which to buy it, okay? And so as aggregate demand rises, the demand for money rises, and vice versa. As the demand for money rises, aggregate demand rises, okay? Therefore, if the demand for money drops, aggregate demand will drop. Now, we're going to talk about this more when we get to monetary policy, but let's just go with what we've got so far. What we just talked about, a couple of slides back, before the graphic illustration of aggregate supply, was the idea that if interest rates rise, that means the cost of borrowing money has risen, okay? That means the price of money has risen. And if price goes up, demand will go down. And so if interest rates rise, the demand for money will drop, which means aggregate demand will drop, okay? And again, we'll deal with all of that in the next one when we deal with monetary policy and the monetary system and how it works. As we had with aggregate supply, we'll discuss the idea of shifts in the aggregate demand curve, and we'll see that the aggregate demand curve is shaped the same as an individual demand curve, But again, I emphasize, they are not the same thing. They are not caused by the same thing. The one thing that they have in common is the idea of real income. Now, when we deal with real income, this is not exactly the same as normal or nominal income. Real income, think of as purchasing power. We had a lengthy explanation of this when we dealt with economic growth and the business cycle, where I gave you an example of wage price ratio and how wage price ratio changes. That's real income. Okay? When real income increases such that wages go up higher than prices go up, you have an increase in real income, then the aggregate demand will rise. That creates the growth cycle. And vice versa. If real income goes down, we're not, and that's one of the things I emphasize with students all the time, beginning with the discussion of economic growth, is the idea that we're really not concerned at all with either prices or wages. We're concerned with the relationship between the two. Okay? If prices are rising, we don't really care so long as wages are rising too. Now, that's not entirely true. In the upper levels, we look at that and see the difficulties involved with simple price increases, particularly with its effect on the supply of money. But at this rate, at this level, we're worried about the wage price ratio. We're worried about purchasing power. That's what we mean by real income. So when real income is up, aggregate demand is up. When real income is down, aggregate demand is down. Now, I just mentioned interest rates. Okay, as the price of money drops, the demand for the money goes up, and therefore aggregate demand will go up. As the price of money goes up, if interest rates go up, then aggregate demand will drop because the price of money is going up. Okay, and then finally, the one that drives me through a tree is the idea of consumer confidence. It drives me through a tree for a couple of reasons. One is because it's very difficult to measure. You can only measure it really on its consequence. Okay, you can't predict that consumer confidence is going to rise or fall. You can only see it rise or fall after it's happened. If the consumers are confident in the economy, if they believe in economic growth, if they believe the economy is strong, then confidence is high, aggregate demand will go up. If they don't, if they fear, and this is really the fear factor that comes into it. This is really more psychological than anything else. If they have a fear factor coming in, if they're afraid that the economy is going to go into recession, then they will be less confident. Aggregate demand will go down, which makes it kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy. In the microeconomics panel, we looked at both with supply and demand. There is a certain self-fulfilling prophecy with expectations of what's going to happen in the future. Probably the best example of consumer confidence and where it gets into an effect is in markets, okay, in the buying and selling of securities. If investors, okay, people that buy stocks and bonds, okay, if they believe that there's going to be an economic downturn, if they believe more specifically that a particular equity will go down in price in the future, they'll begin selling it off. Well, once they start selling it off, especially when they do it in volume, this creates panic throughout the market, and everyone will sell it off. I mentioned to you that last spring there was a major sell-off, not as major as in the fourth quarter last year, where people sold off a grand total of about $4.5 trillion in assets worldwide. Okay, that was dwarfed by what happened in the fourth quarter. In the fourth quarter, the total sell-off worldwide of assets exceeded $8 trillion. That's consumer confidence. It creates a certain, almost a herd mentality. Once people start to panic and they feel that things are going to go bad and they start selling off their assets, that infects everyone. It becomes pandemic. That's consumer confidence, and that'll affect our aggregate demand. We want to make note of aggregate demand and the impact of foreign trade that it has on it, okay, particularly imports in the United States. As imports go up, okay, there is a competition. The competition is between domestic suppliers and foreign suppliers. Well, if people are buying more imports, they're buying more from foreign suppliers. And so their demand from domestic suppliers will drop. This is one of the primary things that the Trump administration has devoted itself to doing, is to try to reverse this trend of increasing imports in the United States. Well, this is the basic reason why. If you're importing more, if you're buying from foreign suppliers, then you're buying less from domestic suppliers, okay? And you see what I say here, whereas an increase in exports leads to greater production, an increase in demand for foreign products does not lead to the growth cycle, okay, but instead takes money away from domestic demand and leads to a reduction in aggregate demand. As we had with aggregate supply, we have the graphic illustration here of aggregate demand, where we have an outward shift from AD1 to AD2 for the reasons that we just talked about, why it would rise up. And you see its movement along the aggregate supply curve. When there's an increase in aggregate demand, you have a general increase in prices and a general increase in output. A reduction in aggregate demand moves us from AD1 to AD3. And we see what there is a reduction in output and a reduction in prices. This movement is consistent with a recessionary part of the business cycle, this with the growth period of the business cycle, which is why ultimately, and I mentioned this earlier, that inflation is really associated with growth stage in the business cycle. And the question, and we'll deal with this a little bit more when we get to monetary policy, one of the primary tasks that the Federal Reserve, one of their primary mandates, is to keep this inflationary trend under control, but to try to foster continual economic growth while keeping this trend, as aggregate demand continues to rise, this trend of increasing prices, to keep it somewhat in check. And it's done that. Last year, I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and added up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks price levels on a monthly basis. And I tracked it, and last year the consumer price index went up about 1.8%. Okay, so the Fed's doing its job. That keeps their target goal. The Federal Reserve's target goal is an inflation rate between 2 and 2.5%. That's kind of what they look for, and so they're achieving that. So they're doing a pretty decent job. I actually think Powell's doing a great job, but we'll deal with that when we get to monetary policy. We'll now deal with the tools available to the government, okay, for fiscal policy, and they generally fall into three categories. The first, and we saw this in the accounting formula for gross domestic product, is government spending. Okay, the government can spend money on itself. It spends money on a number of things. It spends money mostly on public goods. I include with government spending the idea of transfer payments. They work a little bit differently. Transfer payments are money that the government gives people, okay, very simply put. A transfer payment is something the government gives out without an exchange of goods or services. Examples would be Social Security disabilities, welfare, things like that, okay? And I kind of just lump that in with overall government spending. They function a little bit differently, but at our level, at what we're dealing with here, just the basics of economics, we don't need to deal with those differences. And so if government spending is up, that pushes the aggregate demand curve out. If government spending drops, that brings the aggregate demand curve in. Government spending will also have an effect on aggregate supply, and we'll kind of see how that is. But primarily, they're going to be the ones that adjust aggregate demand. The second major tool available, okay, fiscal policy is essentially regulation and government spending and government taxing, okay? Well, this is government spending. Government taxing, they issue taxes in two different levels, right? First is commercial taxes, which is to say corporate taxes, okay? This is the primary tool they'll use to affect aggregate supply. And we talked about it with microeconomics a little bit. One of the things I mentioned is that a lot of people include taxes and technology as reasons for shifts in the microeconomic supply curve. Well, that's true. Okay, that actually does happen, but the reason it happens is primarily what that's doing is changing the cost of production. Same thing's true here with corporate taxes. Okay, if the government lowers the corporate tax rate, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, okay, that the Trump administration put in at the end of its first year, 2017, that became viable in 2018, okay? one of the things it did was it cut the largest corporate tax rate. Well, what that's going to do is reduce their cost of production. Okay, when you reduce their cost of production, that's going to shift the aggregate supply curve outward. Okay, and vice versa. If you increase corporate taxes, it's going to drop aggregate supply. Okay, now individual taxes are what the government's going to use a little bit more to manipulate things, and this will have more of a direct impact on aggregate demand. If we drop individual taxes, that means people have more money in their pocket, okay, which means their disposable income, and therefore their real income, is going to go up, and aggregate demand will rise. I guess I should say really disposable income. Disposable income is, if you get $1 in your pocket, how much of it can you actually spend? The tax rate will change that, okay? If you get $1 in your pocket and you're facing a 20% tax rate, you only get to spend 80 cents of that. The other 20 cents goes to Uncle Sam, all right? So if they drop individual taxes, I have more money in my pocket that I can then spend, okay? So if they drop individual tax rates, aggregate demand will go up. If they raise individual tax rates, aggregate demand will go down. And we'll see by how much that is, kind of. We'll only take a glance at it. In upper level classes, we really kind of calculate it and figure it out and go into a much lengthier explanation. Here, we just want to understand the basic idea of that, and that that's what happens. Because it's not quite exactly a 1-to-1 ratio. And I'll explain why it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, okay? Let's say we have $1 of income. If the government cuts the individual tax rate, okay, from say 20% to say 10%, okay, instead of me having 80 cents of disposable income, I now have 90 cents of disposable income. But really, it's a question of which pocket the money is in, all right? What I mean by that is you have $1 of income, okay? Well, given taxes, I'm splitting that $1 of income with my Uncle Sam, okay? So the question is, how much of that income do I get to spend? And how much of that income do they get to spend? Okay? And how does that affect the aggregate demand? All right? Whether or not the government spends it or I spend it does in fact have an effect on things. Okay? All right. And then finally, we have government regulation. And government regulation is not directly intended to adjust aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but it does, okay? It does it consequentially. Really what regulation is designed to do is to control behavior, okay? Either to like we said before, referee the game to make sure that fair competition is taking place, or to regulate the negative side effects of competition, okay? Well, I mean, in some cases, what we think of as regulation, think of it as kind of like in that sense, the plexiglass in a hockey game. Okay, it has no real effect on the game itself. It increases the cost of production for the teams because they have to put the plexiglass up, but it controls for the negative consequences of the competition and reduces the number of people who get pucks to the head. I'm not sure why that's such a good thing. If they want the good seats where they're right at ice side to see the game real close, well, then you run the risk of getting a puck in the head. I'm not sure why that's a bad thing, but okay, fine. All right. Continuing with the idea of regulation and its effect. Again, regulation is not specifically designed to affect aggregate supply and aggregate demand, but it does so consequentially. And I'll give you a few examples here. There are multiple examples. It was really beginning with it was at the very end of the Carter administration, but it was really the Reagan era where deregulation of the economy was taking place. And we won't get into the lengthy history of government regulation. That's more for, we teach a course at Robert Morris called Business Enterprise and Public Policy, where we go over the length and breadth of government regulation and its history and its effectiveness and all that. Here we just want to kind of skim the surface. And there are, so with a few major examples, the deregulation of the airline industry, which really began in the late 70s, okay? by deregulating it, and we won't get into the nature of that deregulation. It had to do with all things. The way the airline industry worked was it was protected. They had protected markets and protected competition, and then the government would regulate prices to keep them from gouging the consumers. Well, when they deregulated, this allowed for greater competition. Okay, so the quantity of supply went up, the price went down, which increased aggregate supply. The problem that they experienced with particularly airline deregulation is that the airline industry is characterized by enormous fixed costs. Okay, aircraft are enormously expensive things. Airports are enormously expensive things. And so here were all these air carriers, especially what we call the legacy carriers, the old airlines, American, United, TWA, which you guys have probably never heard of, Pan Am, which again you've probably never heard of because they went out of business, because they couldn't handle the competition. Okay, well, what did we see in microeconomics? What the deregulation of the industry did was it allowed greater competition. Well, greater competition pushes the aggregate supply curve outward, which reduces prices. When it reduces prices, okay, that reduces profits. Well, when they're sitting there, when these legacy carriers are sitting there with massive fixed costs, massive sunken fixed costs, and they begin to slash prices to compete with one another, it ultimately reduced their price below average total cost, okay, because of the amortization of their massive fixed costs, their massive fleets, and so they operated at a loss. And they were actually able to do that for quite some time. They did that for quite some time. That phenomenon really began to hit them in the late 80s, and for better than 10 years they operated like that. And how they operated like that is they kept their liquidity going. They made it look as though they were still making money, and how they did that was they kept their liquidity going by borrowing money against their fleets. Okay, so they started having larger and larger corporate leverage, corporate borrowing. Okay, and all that went well until demand for the air industry just collapsed after 9/11, 2001. Okay, everybody was suddenly afraid to fly. And so demand for air travel collapsed, and it was very temporary. It only lasted, the demand for air travel collapsed for all of about 6 months, but it was enough to drop their cash flow to the point that they couldn't meet their finance obligations. So now with banking, we had a very similar problem. Okay, just a brief note to history. In the 1930s, a couple of acts. The big one was Glass-Steagall. Okay, what the Roosevelt administration put in with Glass-Steagall was they separated out commercial banking, where you make your deposits and keep your money, and investment banking. It used to be that commercial banks that took deposits could also do that as investment. They could also be investment banks. Glass-Steagall stopped that because the banks were making some bad investments. That and the Banking Act of 35. But they deregulated this in the 80s to increase aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay, and we talked about it a little bit and we'll talk about it again with the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration, when it came into office, inherited stagflation. They inherited double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. Okay, and they wanted to do something about this. Deregulation was one of Reagan's major strategies for how to end the recession and trigger growth, to reverse the trend of reducing aggregate supply and dropping aggregate demand. Okay, well, in terms of banking deregulation, by deregulating the banks and allowing, among other things, it used to be there was regulation that banks in one state couldn't practice banking in another state. That went away. By allowing the massive increase of banks and deregulation of those banks, okay, that increases the number of banks, and by so doing, the availability of loans. Okay, so that bank reserves, excess reserves in banks, skyrocketed in the 1980s, which made money cheaper. Okay, interest rates dropped, everybody was able to borrow money. All right, well, the problem is that as a result of this deregulation, oversight of the banking industry kind of got overlooked. Okay, they didn't pay as much attention to it. They allowed banks to kind of expand the loans, and in the 90s they began the practice of subprime lending. Okay, they started lending people money that really didn't show enough assets to be able to repay the loan. And so this created the housing bubble. The ultimate upshot of the banking deregulation was the Great Recession, which hit in 2008, which I've mentioned before. And then finally was the deregulation of the trucking industry. And there were a couple of reasons for this. One was the Reagan administration launched a scathing assault on labor unions. Okay, and he cracked a number of them, but he wasn't able to crack the Teamsters. The Teamsters are the truckers union, and he wasn't able to crack them. The Teamsters are, by a considerable margin, the most powerful union in the United States. And one of the major reasons for that is that of all of the labor unions, the Teamsters are the ones that can cripple the country, because they're the truckers. Okay, if they stop working, nothing moves anywhere. Okay, and so the Reagan administration started to try to bring them down a peg. And the way he did this was by deregulating the industry. If you deregulate the industry, okay, it's going to reduce the cost of trucking, the cost of interstate trucking particularly. That's going to push the aggregate supply curve outward. Now, the reason that it attacked the union is because as a result of the aggregate supply curve moving outward, they need more truck drivers. Unions have greater difficulty maintaining solidarity the larger their membership. And so when you increase it with all these new truck drivers, it becomes harder for the Teamsters to maintain solidarity. Okay, but it allowed for the expansion of the trucking industry, and therefore a reduction in transportation costs, which ultimately reduces cost of production and pushes the aggregate supply curve outwards. And there are additional examples. I offer some here. When telephones first started, the American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation got a monopolistic control over it. Over time, really as a result of technological improvements, they broke up the AT&T monopoly. AT&T still operates, but now they have a lot of competition. Okay, so that was the deregulation of that. They deregulated railroads. Okay, so the basic idea is that the major result of deregulation is usually reduction in costs of production, and therefore increases in aggregate supply, which then lead to increases in aggregate demand. Okay. On the other side of things, where regulation increases the cost of production, we have things like, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency or the Consumer Protection Agency, or the Office of Safety and Health, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is OSHA, which is Worker Safety and Health. This is more of an example, as I mentioned, that one of the other things that we have regulation for is regulating the field of competition and protecting society and the labor force and everybody else from the negative consequences of competition. Well, that's what we have here. Okay, and the basic idea is that what these regulations do, unlike the deregulations we just talked about, what these regulations do is they tend to increase the cost of production. Okay, so if we look at just the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency imposed a lot of regulations designed to protect the environment. Okay, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, to force pollution controls. And it's beyond our scope, okay, to offer any kind of a critical analysis or to get involved in any kind of a debate as to whether or not this was a good thing or a bad thing. We don't care. What we care about is what were the economic ramifications. Okay. In terms of the overall effectiveness, yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. The EPA did. The Clean Water Act did work. The Clean Air Act did work. It did clean up the environment. Okay, whether or not you actually wanted to do that or what the economic cost of that's not our concern here. What our concern is that what it does by doing that, when you put, for example, pollution controls on steel mills. My father was the chief in charge. He was superintendent of chemical processing at the Clairton Works for 29 years. Okay, he dealt with the EPA a lot. The EPA came in and they put in regulations requiring a certain amount of filters, a certain filtration system to reduce the impact of the production of coke in the steelmaking process, to reduce the effects of this on the environment. Okay? Well, the problem with that is that the imposition of those regulations forces investment on the part of the corporation, okay, in terms of filtrations, in terms of pollution control, etc. And as a result, it increases their cost of production and reduces their profitability. And it's kind of interesting that the EPA started doing this really in the late 60s and 70s, and the steel industry began its decline at the end of the 70s. It was a contributory factor. It wasn't the major factor. It was a contributory factor. Then you have the Consumer Protection Agency Administration. Okay, they and the Traffic Safety Administration and the National Traffic Safety Administration, which is the NTSA, they're the ones that did things like, okay, well, you have to have seat belts, and you have to have child seats for children, and they have certain regulations below the age of 1, below the age of 2, below the age of 5. Children have to have them, booster seats, things like that, until the age of 8, etc., to keep them safe. And you have to have seat belts installed in cars, etc. That's the Consumer Protection Agency, okay, or the Consumer Protection Administration. And again, the effect of all this, whether or not good or bad, the effect of all this is to increase the cost of production by forcing automobile manufacturers to put in hooks for child safety seats or seat belts or particular types of locks, etc., to keep the consumer safe. It increases their cost of production because they have to change their equipment, change their machinery to install it. Same thing with the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration puts warning labels on food, and they also are the ones that impose the regulation that manufacturers of food products in the United States have to put the nutritional content of their food. That all costs money. Okay, that all costs money to make the labeling making process. It increases the cost of production. And as a result of increasing the cost of production, it'll slide the aggregate supply curve inward, and ultimately have an effect on aggregate demand. OSHA, another one, that's work safety and health by creating all these regulations. It just increases the cost of production. So we have here, warning labels, stricter environmental codes, safety, all of them have the same effect. Okay, they increase cost of production. With the ACA, which is known as Obamacare, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, that regulated the healthcare industry, and it stipulated that everybody had to have health insurance and pay premiums. Well, what's the effect of this economically? The effect of this is not so much on aggregate supply, although it will consequentially have an effect on aggregate supply. Its effect is on aggregate demand. Okay, by forcing me to shell out premiums on health insurance, okay, that takes money away from other things that I could purchase. Remember, our original assumption way long ago is that resources are scarce. I only have so much money. Okay, if you increase the cost of healthcare, and what happened across the board is while they insisted everybody have health insurance, they didn't regulate the premiums that could be charged. And so healthcare premiums went through the roof after Obamacare. And so if you're making me shell out more for health insurance, then I have less money in my pocket to buy other things. And the very famous case here, and I won't get into it in any great length, we do in American national government, and we do actually in history too as well, is Sebelius versus the National Federation of Independent Business, 2012. That was when Obamacare, the ACA, was challenged, and the Supreme Court upheld part of it and got rid of part of it. It was a very strange decision that the Supreme Court made. The Supreme Court said, well, no. you can't, like the defense of the government, the defense of Obamacare can't be based on regulation of interstate commerce, which Congress has the right to do in Article 1, Section 8, because you can't force people to engage in an act of commerce simply so you can go and then regulate that act of commerce. Okay, in other words, if people weren't going to engage in the act of commerce, namely buying insurance, then you can't force them to so do. Okay, simply so you can then regulate them. All right, but what they upheld it with was the penalty. Okay, if you didn't buy health insurance and prove that you had health insurance on your taxes, they could charge you an extra tax for not having health insurance. The Supreme Court ruled they're allowed to do that because they have the power under Article 1, Section 8 of taxation. So they're allowed to impose whatever tax they like. Okay? And interestingly, in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, one of the things that went away was the tax penalty for not having health insurance. That's now gone. Okay? And so what did that do? That the ultimate upshot of what I'm saying here with that is it's an inward shift of aggregate demand. I have less money in my pocket to buy other things. We move on to the idea of kind of spending. We just want to make a kind of a note on this because what we're going to look at now is the effect, in rough and ready terms, of government policy on spending, okay, on aggregate demand, because government policies, what we've been looking at, the fiscal policies, they have an effect on both aggregate demand and aggregate supply, particularly aggregate demand, but we haven't talked about how much of an effect they have. And we'll take a look at that. And again, we're just skimming the surface on this. And this is not nearly as complicated as it looks. It's actually fairly intuitive. Okay, and we're dealing with two: marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save. And you see the actual definitions of them here. It's very simple to understand. If you have $1 of income, okay, you can either spend that or not spend that. You can spend some portion of that and not spend the other portion of that. Well, the money that you do not spend, we refer to as savings. So you can either spend or save, spend or not spend. All right, simple enough. And so when you add and the marginal propensity is the percentage that you either spend or save. So the MPC is the marginal propensity to consume, which is the percentage of each dollar you spend, and the MPS is the marginal propensity to save, and it's the percentage of each dollar that you do not spend, okay, which is to say you save it. When you add them together, they have to equal 1, okay, it's an identity. Since you can't, you know, have more than that $1. If you have $1, you can't spend and save more than $1. You have that dollar. You actually can if you go into debt, but we won't deal with that right now. Okay, now from our previous discussions of gross domestic product and fiscal policy tools, we know that if government spending is up, production is up, incomes increase, aggregate demand goes up, etc. And MPC answers by how much. So what we're going to create is what we call the consumption multiplier. And when we get to fiscal or to monetary policy, we'll also see that there's a savings multiplier as well, that has more of an effect on investment and how much investment will be created. Now let's look at the consumption multiplier. And again, it's easier than it looks. All right. The consumption multiplier, okay, which will give us the actual change in aggregate demand based on this government fiscal policy. Primarily, this one has to do with taxes, okay? You take the change in income and multiply it by 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Now, if you do the algebra, this 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume is the same as the marginal propensity to save, okay? Because 1 equals, remember from the previous slide, 1 equals the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to consume. So if we say 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, that's the marginal propensity to save. So it's either or. They're the same thing. Okay, if you look at it, they're the same thing. And so 1 over that number, okay, That's your multiplier, okay? And the easiest way to explain it is by way of example. Let's suppose that we have a margin per propensity to consume, an MPC of 90%. Now what that means is that a person will spend 90 cents of every dollar of additional income. Okay, the other 10 cents will be used for savings. All right, and so that's going to create a multiplier of the $1 of additional income, okay, multiplied by the multiplier, which is 1 over 1 minus the margin propensity to consume, or 1 multiplied by 1 over the margin propensity to save, which is 10%. Okay, that means equals 1 times 10, or $10. So that $1 in additional income, for example, if the dollar gives a $1 tax break, if you save $1 because of a government tax break, that will create $10 worth of spending. Okay, so it has a massive multiplier. At higher level economics, okay, in both macroeconomics and then even more in intermediate macro, we look at how this is modified. This is going to be modified by a number of factors, which we're not really going to look at here. I'll just mention them. Because, for example, of this dollar of income, okay, we're assuming that you spend 90 cents of it and save 10 cents of it. Well, a certain amount of that dollar goes to taxes, a certain amount of that dollar goes to buying imported products, which means it leaves the economy, etc. We don't worry about that right now. We'll worry about that later on in higher level economics classes. Okay, so now the reason that it multiplies this way is, think it through. Okay, I spend 90 cents out of the dollar. The person with whom I spent that 90 cents now spends 90% of that, which is 81 cents. That person now spends 90%, which is 72 cents, etc., all the way down until there's no money left. Well, when all is said and done, that $1 of income that I had, of which I spent 90 cents, ultimately is a 10 to 1 factor. It'll ultimately create $10 worth of income. So if the MPC drops, then the multiplier effect drops. And what drops the MPC, as I just mentioned, which we don't get into at any great length, are certain modifying factors like the purchase of imports, like government taxing it, etc. Okay. As we've just said, the money that is not spent is saved. Question, of course, is what happens to that savings? Okay, what does the bank do with the money that I deposit? Okay, primarily what the bank is going to do with the money that I deposit, it doesn't leave it there waiting for me to come and visit it or take it. What the bank does with it is lend it out. Okay, and so the total amount of money lent is derived from their excess reserves. And we'll deal with the idea of excess reserves when we get to monetary policy. Under federal law, the Federal Reserve requires its member banks to keep a certain percentage of all of their deposits on reserve at their Federal Reserve Bank, okay, in case they're needed. And so a bank can only lend out a certain amount. That's on paper, okay, and we'll deal with that when we get to monetary policy a little bit more. So that's what we refer to as excess reserves. Excess reserves are their deposits minus what they have to keep at the Federal Reserve, which they will then lend out. Okay, it has a similar multiplier for monetary policy, and we'll see it then.